Good afternoon, I'm the Modern Warfare historian, and we, not some director. Yes, we're back with the Revolutionary Weapon series. Last time, while analyzing the FT Char, we took a look at its development and production. Now, those produced metal beasts get to the front line of the scorched countryside in France. Will they achieve victory by terrorizing the enemy and cause a complete enemy front collapse, or will they bog down and be a waste of resources? In order to answer this question, well, let's get started. The first appearance of the Renault tanks was on the 31st of May 1918 during the Third Battle of the Aisne at the Forest de Retz near Soissons. It had been decided that these tanks would be used when at least 12 battalions were ready. However, the Germans were doing a very annoying advance and the French rushed 3 battalions of the 501st Regiment to the battlefield. Due to battle preparation problems, such as that some vehicles were delivered by truck while others had to go on their own power, in the end only 30 tanks in total from the 304th and 305th Company were available. The tanks were divided in 6 platoons of 5 tanks each, and were divided into groups. One would support the attack on Chazelle, while the other would help with the capture of Ploissy. Machine guns were suppressing the French infantry of the 4th and 7th Marching Tirailleurs Regiment of the Moroccan Division. The Renault suppressed the enemy guns and then were under fire from German artillery, called upon them by a reconnaissance plane. The infantry was lagging behind, so the tanks went back to lead them forward. Then, after being able to bring some soldiers to the ravine, that was the objective of the Renault, 2 German 37mm guns were observed, presumably those were 3.7 tank Abwehrkanone Rheinmetall. One of them was knocked out, while the other hit a tank, setting it on fire. The other tanks withdrew, having achieved their objective. However, the few Moroccans that advanced with the tanks were then soon pushed back by a German counterattack. On the 2nd of June, companies 307th, 308th and 309th of the 3rd Renault Battalion were used to support an attack near Favrol-Courcy. Here the infantry cooperated with the tanks and together they were able to advance 250 yards beyond the objective. Then the various platoons were divided from one another to support smaller attacks with great success, except when on the 4th of June the attacks on Grill Farm was handicapped by heavy woods. The first attack succeeded, but the forces were then forced back and the farm had to be attacked again the following day. The French also had some other problems near the Forest of Retz, especially near the Grill Farm in the following days, but their efforts were mainly successful in the various counterattacks, although the limitations in visibility and mobility in the wood areas were something to be reckoned with. Not everyone was happy of the way the tanks had been deployed, such as Captain Danil, and I quote, "Disengagement by smaller factions supporting such small infantry units that they were occasionally insufficient to hold the ground after it had been taken by the tanks, this prolonged waiting in the immediate vicinity of the front line, this perpetual alert which did not permit giving the machines the necessary care nor the men their indispensable rest, were essentially conditions unfavorable to the employment of tanks. These conditions had been imposed by circumstances, by the critical situation of corps and divisions which had no reserves, by the exhaustion of units in the lines which needed immediate assistance to disengage themselves from the enemy's too active pressure or to help them regain lost positions. Men and machines had been subject to a harsh test which they had passed with flying colors. Had they not been capable, the Forest de Retz would have been lost. On June 3rd or 4th, the Germans would have been in Villers-Cotterêts, perhaps in the heart of Valois. On the 28th of June, 60 Renault tanks participated in a battle near Coutry-Saint-Pierre-Aiglay, helping the 153rd French Division and the 3rd Moroccan Infantry Brigade. The idea behind the plan was sound: help the infantry forward in taking the objective, wait with them until they have entrenched themselves enough and then regroup. Of course, between plan and reality there is always at least a baguette of distance. The 307th Company, after some problems with the coordination with the infantry, as the infantrymen gave the tankers wrong information regarding directions, were able to reach the objectives, albeit with considerable losses of around 30 casualties. The 308th was more successful and lost a single man wounded in action. The 309th had some problems, but was still successful and lost only 1 man killed and 9 wounded. Between the 18th of July and the 26th, a force of 478 tanks was used near Sassuan. These were 123 Schneider tanks, 110 Chamond, and 253 Renault. On the first day, around 233 of these tanks were used and most of the attacks were successful, even though the Saint-Chamond tanks had a lot of mechanical troubles. But I must say that these tanks had problems even before the start of the attack, and many breakdowns were expected. 102 tanks would be casualties, 62 because of enemy artillery, and 40 for mechanical troubles. Around 25% of the crews were casualties. The following day, 195 tanks were used and 50 of these were destroyed by the artillery that caused a 22% rate of casualties. Repairs were done in the night, but the following days was even worse, as fewer tanks were available and those were allocated in smaller numbers. Plus, enemy anti-tank artillery was becoming better and losses were considerable. Tanks gave a great impetus to the Sassuan advance at the start, but without fresh infantry support that could follow, they were very vulnerable to enemy AT fire. The commitment of vehicles in small numbers also did not help, by making every tank overwhelmed by enemy fire. On the 1st of August, the 330th Renault Tank Company lost 10 tanks due to direct fire from two 77mm guns. On the 28th, near Crécy-Aumont, 7 Renault tank battalions were used by the French 10th Army. The initial attack did not go as planned and the French lost 12 tanks. The following day was better, with the tanks being able to clear a lot of enemy machine gun positions. On the 31st, in the same area, 24 enemy tanks were knocked out by very effective German anti-tank fire. On September the 14th, 3 Renault battalions supported the attacks near Manejan and Colombe farms of the 1st and 20th Corps. Due to unfavorable terrain that, because of the rain and ravines, made tank operations difficult, the attacks had a lot of problems and some tanks were put out of action by enemy artillery. In the Champagne area on the 26th of September, 150 Renault and 32 Schneider tanks were used, with 2 Renault battalions, probably of 45 tanks each, and 2 Saint-Chamond groups of probably 10 tanks each, were kept as a reserve. The cooperation between the tanks and the infantry was reported of being very successful. In this attack, the tanks were very useful and although heavy losses were suffered, the objectives had been achieved. During the Flanders offensive, 3 Renault companies and a groupment of Saint-Chamond were used near Hoglage-Thielt between the 26th of September and the 20th of October. The tanks were mostly successful, but they suffered 50% casualties. The 19th Tank Battalion, that was part of the 507th Tank Regiment, was allocated with its 69 Renaults to the French 15th Corps for the attack near Saboncourt. Very bad planning of the movement of the tanks before the battle almost risked that the Renaults would miss the battle entirely. The attack started on October the 17th at 5:30 a.m. The French advanced and were able to achieve their intermediate objective, although with some considerable losses. Following actions in the same area were a mixture of successes and failures, but in the end the French tank provided adequate for what they were being asked to do. The French found some German anti-tank rifles and found that those could penetrate the Renaults. The Americans had also Renaults, as we have seen in the last episode. They used them in the Saint-Mihiel offensive on September the 12th, 1918. This attack was done with the help of the 505th French Tank Regiment, with 125 Renaults and 36 Saint-Chamond, and the 304th American Tank Brigade, with 2 battalions of Renaults and 2 groups of Schneider tanks. And before you ask, I do believe that these Schneider tanks in the American Tank Brigade were manned by French crews, as the Americans had, in theory, only French Renaults and British Mark VI tanks. The attack started as planned until the tanks encountered the first enemy trenches, where they had a lot of problems in the crossing, wasting a lot of time and fuel. 25 tanks reached Nonsard before the infantry and silenced a lot of machine guns and 77mm guns in the area. By 3 p.m, however, the tanks were almost out of fuel, as they consumed it faster than expected. Of the total 174 tanks of the 304th Tank Brigade, 22 were ditched and 21 had mechanical problems. Also, the French 505th Tank Regiment had problems with the terrain and some vehicles bogged down in the mud. The following day, because of a road jam near Friray, the tanks were unable to receive their badly needed fuel, so no tank action of importance was performed on the 13th. To give you an idea, it took 32 hours for the trucks to move 9 miles. In order to help the 1st US Division under the command of Major General Charles Pelleau-Sameral, some fuel was drained from the reserve tanks in order to fill 7 tanks. At 2 p.m., the fuel for the 344th Battalion arrived, and 50 tanks from this unit reached Vigneux at midnight, while 30 tanks of the 345th Battalion and 22 French tanks moved up to Saint-Benoît. On the 14th September, having received no news from the 1st Division by noon, a patrol of 3 tanks and 5 dismounted men was sent towards Jeanville, and this unit encountered a German battalion marching in close column. The enemy battalion was attacked and scattered, and then the tanks came under 77mm artillery fire. 2 of the 3 tanks failed mechanically, and the platoon commander hooked both to his tanks and towed them back to the battalion area. Believing a counterattack was imminent, the battalion commander decided to remain in position. No counterattack happened, however. At 6 p.m. a low-flying German plane passed over the tanks, and believing his tanks had been spotted, the battalion commander ordered them 500 yards to the south. A short time later, a heavy artillery concentration hit the previous position. These tank units also served during the Meuse-Argonne offensive from the 26th of September to the 1st of November 1918. The Renaults were very successful in both achieving their objective and helping the infantry. However, after a couple of days, most of the tanks were out of action due to mechanical problems that were also caused by the fact that the tank parks and their sole positions were very distant, usually 10 to 20 kilometers. It was also noted that the Renault had an inefficient cooling system and that they had problems with the fan belt. Also, the engine usually overheated and the pistons sometimes seized the cylinders. Obviously, it mostly depended on the production quality of the parts, and it was reported that the tanks of an unspecified manufacturer were satisfactory for only 100 hours before failing rapidly after that time. To give you some numbers, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, there were also French different tanks, and these were 214 Renault, 16 Saint-Chamond, and 22 Schneiders. 99 Renault tanks were lost or abandoned, as well as 5 Saint-Chamond and 9 Schneiders. Tank losses were of 18 officers and 149 men. During the 16 engagement they took part into, they used 125,570 gallons of gasoline, 1,058 belts of machine gun ammo, 1,152 rounds of 75mm, and 7,878 rounds of 37mm cannon. All in all, the Renault tanks were found to be very useful when they were able to work together with the infantry, and had the benefit of being more reliable than the Saint-Chamond and the Schneiders. After the First World War, the Renault tanks remained in service and received a lot of upgrades. They served in the Russian Civil War, the Polish-Soviet War, and the Estonian Civil War. They also saw action in the various conflicts in China, both internal ones between warlords and with external foes like the Soviet Union and the Japanese Empire. The Renaults were used in colonial conflicts like the pacification of Libya by the Italians, the French used them in Syria in the late 1920s, and the Spaniards used the Renaults in the Rif War. During the Rif War, also the Renaults were used in the first amphibious attack involving tanks, when 17 tanks were used, 11 of these being Renault. The Brazilians used the Renault to crush various internal revolts. During the Spanish Civil War, they were used by both sides. As more time passed, they became more obsolete. That was not a problem if you were fighting irregular forces or against a very outdated state, yet it would become one if your enemy had anything capable of penetrating your armor. This was the case for the Second World War, as these tanks was used by the Polish, the Finnish, the French, the Greek, the Romanian, and the Yugoslavian. It comes to no surprise that their efficiency was rather poor when they came in contact with enemy armor or enemy infantry equipped with anti-tank weaponry. Some were used by the Germans and by the Vichy French government. And when I say some, I mean a lot of them, as the Germans captured around 1,700 Renaults, renamed Panzerkampfwagen.
Panzerkampfwagen 17R, 18R 730, F.
Yes, that thing. And with F meaning Frankreich. That means French in German. And used around 750 of them for various third-line roles, especially internal security. Renault turrets were used also to augment the Maginot Line and the Atlantic Wall by the French and the Germans respectively. A lot of nations used the Renaults. Last time we saw that France, the United States, Great Britain, Italy and Romania had them during the First World War, although only the French and the Americans, and possibly the British, used them in the conflict. The Italians sent 4 or 6 to Libya in 1919, as we saw in the video on the Italian tank development, and we already saw that they developed the Fiat 3000 project from the Renault design. The Romanians had received a small batch in 1917 for training purposes, and in 1919 they received another batch of around 72 to 76 tanks. More than half of these armed with the 37mm gun, in order to give Romania a chance in case of Soviet invasion. In the late 1930s they were removed from active service and were sent back as training tanks. In the alphabetical order, the other foreign operators were Afghanistan, that received a small number of Renaults, probably around 8, from the Soviets before or around the invasion of Afghanistan, and some of these, from 2 to 4, were found by the Americans in Taliban possession in 2003. What happened to these is unknown. Belgium acquired 54 Renaults in 1919 and used them in a tank regiment until 1934, before moving them to the Gendarmerie and, in 1938, to the depot. Brazil received 12 in 1921, and these were 7 armed with the 37mm gun, 4 with the machine guns, and 1 TSF version. They later received 28 more, and these were in active service until 1938 and in training service until 1942. The Republic of China received around 20 Renaults. Croatia had 24 Renaults, Czechoslovakia had 7 and Estonia had 12. Finland had 34 Renaults, and most of these saw action during the Winter War in 1939. Iran had some, however I was unable to find any accurate information if those tanks were ever delivered. Japan bought 13 tanks in 1919 together with a batch of British-made Mark A Whippets. The French tanks were called Ko-Gata and composed the 1st Imperial Japanese Army Tank Company at Kurume, and were used for officer training. Some of these were later transferred to the Army Cavalry School. The Japanese had also 10 Otsugata Shensha that were Renault NC-27s. These tanks were an upgraded version of the Renault original tanks. These were a heavier and more powerful version, and if you are interested in the subject, I recommend you to take a look at it on Tank Encyclopedia. Link is in the description. And yes, when I say in alphabetical order, I was joking. I'm putting all the nations at random. The Lithuanians bought 12 Renaults. Manchukuo had some, and the Dutch bought a single one vehicle used for trials. The Philippines had one vehicle, and the Polish had a bigger number of them. The Polish bought 23 Renaults in 1919, and those saw action in the Russo-Polish War in only the last part of the conflict. Some were used in the Battle of Warsaw. Other orders were made, and at one point the Polish had around 174 Renaults in service. As around 60,000 Polish troops had served in the Western Front during the First World War, when these units came back they bought a lot of Renaults. These tanks were used in the Polish 1st Tank Regiment that was created with personnel of the former French 505th Tank Regiment. This unit participated in the Russo-Polish War. In 1924 the Polish received 6 Renault TSF that were the unarmed command version, and in 1929-1930 they received 5 Renault with the Kegress half-track system, and they also bought 1 Renault NC-27. The Polish tried to improve the design of the original Renault with minor changes, and they were also able to produce around 27 Renaults using available spare parts. The Renaults were later be put in reserve as training vehicles, and some were sold abroad, mainly to Yugoslavia and the Second Spanish Republic. Before the German invasion in 1939, Poland had around 100 Renaults. Let's go to the east, in Russia, that during the First World War in 1917 had fell in a revolution, and 3 years later in a civil war between the White Army and the Red one. The White Army had received some tanks from Great Britain. These were the Heavy Mark V, the Medium Mark A, the Medium Mark B, and they also used the French light Renaults. Since this is an interesting topic in itself, we'll probably cover the employment of tanks in the Russian Civil War in a separate video, so here we will focus just on the Renaults. From what I was able to understand, the White Army had around 20 Renaults. 6 of these were lost in February and March 1919, while the armored Red Partisans captured 10 that had been sent from the Americans to Vladivostok. One of the captured Renaults, although probably not one of those captured by the armored Red Partisan, was then disassembled, studied and reproduced in 1920 by the Red Army. The Reds, after winning the Civil War, would later produce a modified version of the Renaults called come on! Seriously?
Мали сопровождение первии.
Thank you. That means Small Support Vehicle Number 1, also known as MS-1 or T-18. This vehicle had a 37mm gun and a machine gun and was produced from 1928 to 1931. Around 960 of these were produced in various versions and were used mainly as training tanks. Some of these would later be picked up again in 1941 when the Germans invaded and were fitted 45mm guns. And some of these were used basically as a static tank. The Red Army also tried to upgrade the design again with the T-19, but this did not show mass production. And yes, you will hear more about these tanks whenever we will discuss the development of the Soviet tanks in the interwar period. I do believe that after the Italian video on the matter, the Germans will follow and then the Soviets, but take my words for grain of salt as I do not have our schedule on hand, and we do tend to change it often. Still, one day it will probably analyze. The Spanish had at first a single Renault with machine guns and a single Renault TSF, together with a single Schneider and a single Fiat 3000. During the Reef War, Spain was able to purchase 10 Renaults and 1 Renault TSF that were delivered in January 1922. Their service was not interesting as during the first battle 2 machines broke down and were later destroyed by Reef forces. However, the Renaults were used in the landing at Alhucemas in Morocco, and they proved to be a good asset. Sweden also bought a single Renault NC2 in the 1920s armed with the 37mm gun. It was used for trials but was not well received and was then used as a radio vehicle. This was because it was found to have problems with the transmission, trucks and suspension. The Swiss bought 2 in 1918 and 3 in 1929, and these were used as a training vehicle. Turkey received from France enough tanks to create a tank company. Sadly, I do not have an exact number. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia had around 35 to 40 Renaults and around 10 Renault NC2. Numbers are not very precise, but what it is known is that the Yugoslav army was able to create a battalion composed of 3 companies with 3 platoons of 3 tanks each. That, if counted with the reserves, gave a total of 48 Renaults and NC2s combined. At the start of the Second World War, Yugoslavia had around 45 Renault and 10 or 11 NC2s. Last but not least, apparently Yemen had a single Renault and this was used recently as a static guard post. Around 41 Renault still exist today, as well as 26-ton tanks, 2 Russian Renaults and 3 TSF. This brings an end to our video. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching and remember to always move away your tanks if you do believe your rallying point has been spotted.